Okay, last night was April 19th, and we focused on writing with humor and adding voice to our writing. So, one of the focuses that we had were on humor devices. Another focus was on establishing our voice. For humor devices, we talked about irony, paradox, and ambiguity. For establishing our voice, we worked on a couple different pieces of punctuation like dashes and ellipses. We talked about colloquialisms and allegory. In our discussion of irony, paradox, and ambiguity, we kind of recapped what we already knew. Many of us knew a little bit, but when we see a definition and can articulate it in our own words, I always feel like we know it a little bit more. We had talked about how practicing with certain devices could certainly enhance our writing style. So if, let's say, metaphors, all writers use metaphors, working through practice sessions where you're trying to use metaphors can certainly help you in the long run. One of the big questions was, do writers go back and purposefully put these things in because a good story is dependent upon literary devices. To that, I said, not really. I feel like this is part of the nature of writing. You become somebody who gets comfortable with that, and it becomes part of your style. I don't know that you really think about, hey, this is a good place for irony. I think in the whole concept of thinking about what you're trying to do, you've probably already started toying around with trying to do or say something opposite, and then that just comes out in your writing. So to me, the more practice you have, the better you get. In establishing voice, we talked a lot about punctuation, specifically the dash and the ellipsis, and how a simple piece of punctuation can certainly lend more personality, more voice to a piece of communication. You can emphasize certain words or phrases simply by throwing a dash in front of it, or an ellipsis to slow things down. Visually, the dash and the ellipsis are attractive pieces of punctuation that, whether a reader realizes it or not, their eyes are trained to those devices. Many of us just instinctively know through the years of reading that an ellipsis is slow, perhaps giving a suspension of thought, or a trailing off or an interruption. The dash, being the most harsh, abrupt break that we have, certainly commands attention, and there's a little bit more of a tone behind the use of a dash. With colloquialisms, we just talked about trying to get to know our characters, where they're from, their personalities, what would they grow up knowing and being comfortable with, and then how does that affect their language? Coming from different geographical regions, there are little phrases that might mean something to someone that for another person not from that area may not have a clue about. But those are certainly ways that you could add some voice and some personality to your writing. The last one was a big one, which was allegory, and that's where we get very abstract. And sometimes a character's name will represent an abstract quality, typically revolving around a moral, social, or religious idea. Allegories are great for a writer who has a specific purpose in mind. I want to teach my audience a lesson. I want to shock them into understanding. I want to nail them down and force them to consider this alternative. And a lot of times those big ideas are things that eat away at us about society, about the way people act, which are very abstract things. So we had talked about Kurt Vonnegut's Billy Pilgrim. Pilgrim, the name associates a great journey. And in fact, that main character, Billy Pilgrim, does go on a big journey and learns a great deal about life and morals and living. So if you have this idea that you think is a pretty big idea, but it's like the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, perhaps toying with allegory and really hitting us with a message at the end could certainly be a good way to put some voice in there and get your message across to people in an artful way. So, we did talk a little bit about Pat Conroy's Lords of Discipline. We talked about chapter 20 where the kids had anticipated other characters in stealing their fudge. They knew they were going to lose it. We talked about the irony of that chapter where it's the opposite of what you would expect and how they kind of set up. We didn't really have time to get into it. But we focused more on Vonnegut's allegory of Roland Weary. We focused on, what dialogue characters would say versus when a narrator might explain things in prose, which is sometimes a bit of a battle for a writer. What do I want my characters to facilitate? What actions do I want to facilitate? Etc. So. And then we wrap things up by talking a little bit about publishing, and the two ways that I brought up were, entering contests. If you Google short story contest, poetry contest, you're going to get tons and tons of choices out there. Some of them are big, that have money, cash prizes, many of which would ask you to actually pay for your entry fee. But there are contests, if you look hard enough, that are free submissions. You may have to do a little bit of background checking on some of those contests, but certainly that's a good way to get some recognition. And if they're able to provide feedback and send you your copy back, that's one of the things that I look for, which could certainly help you improve the next time. The last thing we talked about in publishing was actually setting up your own blog, which is a relatively easy process, and there are lots of choices out there. But basically, you're publishing yourself, and you're out on the internet for just about anybody to get on and enjoy some of the pieces that you read. You can open up a comment box where your reader can actually leave you comments and tell you whether they liked it, didn't like it, suggestions. And if you find a group that's kind of doing the same thing, it's pretty easy to tie the blogs together so that you build a community that can certainly help each other. So those were kind of the focuses of the April 19th, using humor and voice in your writing. And we left it with some additional resources that if you're interested on how to get published, there's a link to a website from a publisher that kind of gives us some really good insight. And the book, The Art of Fiction by James Gardner, really talks about some different issues that a writer should be aware of if they're interested in being published. Your assignment was left with writing a fable using characters or events from your time in the service. You could certainly recreate your fable with animal characters that would take on the persona, which is what a lot of fable writers like Aesop and George Orwell does, but you certainly don't have to do that. But we are looking for that ultimate author purpose. What is the message that you really want to send? And without directly stating it, will we get it from the events that take place in your writing?